So on upcoming events, we do have a desire, generally speaking, to get something into Usenix winter. It looks like we've got a deadline for that coming up in June. There's a question about if anyone has any suggestions around around DEF CON and presenting there, or possibly villages to present to there. Do we have anyone who's plugged in on the DEF CON side on this call right now? I know we have people who aren't here who are, but do we have anyone currently here who is? Okay. Do we have any more on the RustConf stuff? I know you'd raised this, Andrew.
Yeah, so this was, and actually I just pull it back up. I was just looking at this. So I'll drop the link to the CFP. I guess the question is basically whether we think that there's something to say. So this is the CFP. They basically give 4 categories of things that they think would be interesting. There's basically Rust in new and exciting places, which I don't think is relevant here. Extremely cursed, which I hope would not be the right one for talking about OmniBOR. Raising all boats. I feel like this is the one that would make the most sense. This is basically like using Rust to, as it says here, make some other communities better, other languages, other fields. You know, we could make an argument of, hey, like if the OmniBOR implementation for Rust is in a good place and it's, you know, integratable with, you know, things to then say, hey, look, now, you know, with Rust you get this OmniBOR thing, and, you know, here are the benefits you get of being able to identify and your artifacts and to have these manifests in this dependency graph. I think the question is just, what do we anticipate would be able to be in place by the time of needing to record and submit the actual talk? Because it'd be great if there's like a win of saying, you know, hey, we've implemented OmniBOR and here's like, you know, experimental integration of it into Cargo as an example.
Well, we could also, one of the other things we can actually do is, I don't know if you've ever practiced conference-driven development.
No, I haven't.
Highly recommend. It sharpens the mind. But I mean, we could essentially just say, look, let's figure out what we would want to talk about, and let's maybe look at trying to drive towards having some POC Rust compiler integration to show leading into this. Because I know right now we're sort of building the pieces and parts that we'll use for that.
Yep.
And then it's just a matter of plugging it into the Rust compiler.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something about having a stake in the ground on a talk that sharpens the mind. And we're far enough out in time here, since we're talking about September, that it's not outrageous to approach the problem this way. I've occasionally heard people are like, well, we've got this conference in mumble, current month +2. Let's go. No, we're not doing that. This is right. almost 6 months out at this point. And so that's plenty of time for us to actually get some stuff together. And it might, as I said, sharpen the mind a little bit on the Rust integration.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Okay, so that could be something to shoot for then. Would probably be like, I think, yeah, if we can say, hey, look, we've got experimental integration of this stuff into Cargo, that would be, you know, perhaps a compelling pitch. With the making also the broader point of, you know, we've really integrated it in Cargo. You could integrate it in lots of other things, and you know, so it's not just like a Rust specific thing.
Well, and we have examples of it integrated in other things, right? So, for example, we've got the GCC and the LLVM integration. You know, if we're in a good enough place with the Rust integration, you might even, because I know that Rust. I'm not as okay. Let me back up. I'm not as familiar with the mechanics of how Rust integrates build process with C, but it might be neat to do something where it's like, okay, so we built this library in C, and then we got this Rust thing that uses it via the foreign function interface, and from that we can see effectively the pieces pulling forward, and now we've got visibility through Rust back to C that nobody else is really even trying to do.
Yeah,
make sense? Yeah,
and actually, I mean, I will say too, with the LLVM integration, I mean, Rust is built on LLVMs. So there could be, you know, like to say like, hey, look, yeah, some of the stuff you just get for free from the stuff that we're doing with LLVM.
Well, so, my perception is Barathi has done a lot of things in sort of that vein, in that the things that Barathi, correct me if I'm wrong, Barathi, keep me honest here, but like the things that you've built in the ELF backend, basically are just looking to see if somebody upstream has told you something. And so the work for Rust would primarily be work that would need to be done in the front end. And once you've done it in the front end,
to give that info to LLVM.
Right.
Yes,
Say, hey, if
great.
there's so hopefully, modular the fact that a lot of niceties have been done with Rust in order to make it easy for people to just go and install cargo and get going, which obscures the visibility into what's sort of coming from upstream. Hopefully that actually makes it better. And I vaguely recall chatting with some folks at the LLVM summit, and I think if I recall correctly, Rust is lagging a little bit behind the bleeding edge of LLVM. So there might be a little bit of stuff there, but you effectively don't have to redo the work of the ELF backend. That's already been done. Nice.
Okay. No, and that's awesome. And I think that makes a good story as well. So that's okay. I mean, so
well, particularly I will say, good.
I was going to say tentatively. I mean,
Oh, perfect. So, any help you need, please don't hesitate.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Cool. And then OpenSSF Summit for Vancouver is coming up in Vancouver on May 10th. This was just announced recently. It's co-located with the Open Source Summit, which is always nice. I like a co-located event. Gets you the chance to run around and play with lots of extra people. And that CFP is open until March 17th. And this is sort of more of a security focused group with OpenSSF. So if there's any folks who have more of a security bent who would like to sort of give that talk, or would like to propose a talk, we could certainly, as a community, be supportive of that. Also, Vancouver is lovely in May. If you've not been, you really must. Okay. All right then. So folks are inspired on that one, please do. I don't think we have Chris here today on the request for feedback on the blog post. Before we sort of dive into the road to the initial spec, is there anything that folks would like to bring up beforehand? Because we're about to enter the kind of territory where we merrily get lost. And unlike some of the other folks who will run this meeting from time to time, who are excellent at organizing the timing of these things, I am not the best at holding things in time boxes. So wanted to give the opportunity up front. All right then. So we had this whole discussion that we had about restoring the NXB on the ELF embedding. And in the course of this actually turned into a very productive review, not only of transitioning this, but also, let's see. So there were a lot of really, really good reviews on this about getting some of the pieces right. Jeremy had asked that we point to the ELF notes, which I think I fixed acceptably. In the sense that I do now have links into ELF spec information. When we're talking about sections. So when persisting the getoid to the ELF sec, you should create an ELF section, and I do have a pointer to the Linux Foundation's spec for ELF. And specifically ELF sections. Does that sort of meet the need that folks had in mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think the key point there was just making sure that when we use ELF terminology in the spec, it's clear that it is ELF terminology, not just some new term that we're introducing.
True. And one of the things I actually went to look for was if there was any nice, clean, easily linkable place to point to like the SSG node and the SHF alloc. And the closest I could come to was pointing to the section. And so rather than repeating that multiple times, I figured I would give the entry point up here, and then hopefully people would find some of these things that we're using that's ELF related as they went from there. I'm definitely open to improvements as always.
I'm not super familiar with the current sort of ELF documentation, but I'm sure there's probably something that's a bit more specific talking about ELF notes and their structure and stuff, like the
there are the tricky part in my experience, and maybe people have found better docs than I have, is that you have sort of quasi-authoritative things for ELF, like the reference spec and the Linux standards base. And then you have really, really, really good explainer articles for ELF. But often they're not quite the same thing. And so like I said, I'm very open to if folks have other sort of places to link to that are more helpful. But this was sort of the best I could come up with at the time. Okay. And then we had a late breaking set of comments that I think had come in through Andrew. And there were some that were just really good nits being picked, and I simply just fixed those. But I think at the end of it all, there was this question about renaming OmniBOR document to artifact to something else, right? So Andrew was talking about OmniBOR identifier, get away, artifact dependency identifier, and how we sort of have a mishmash of terms. And there actually is a discussion that broke out. Since we now have GitHub discussions, I know there was a request for something more durable. Do you want to talk us through some of this, Andrew?
Sure. Yeah. So this was basically, so it was about 2 weeks ago that I had that initial sort of, hey, I'm reading through the spec and recognizing that there are different terms for some of this stuff, and also wanting to clarify for myself of, what exactly do we mean? Are there situations where these terms are referring maybe to distinct things? And I think clarifying exactly what the sort of objects within OmniBOR are, and then actually yesterday morning, had this conversation with someone who was basically asking, what is OmniBOR, and in having that conversation, sort of came upon like this, and it also builds off of last week's discussion about terminology as well. I think basically where I've come down is you have three things. You have the artifact identifiers, which are just the hash in the style of Git. So of course, like having the little prefix of the type of object and the length in bytes of the thing that you're hashing, but then followed by just the contents. And then you have the manifest, which describes in the canonical ordering with all of the hashes, all of the inputs into building something. And then optionally also, if any of those inputs have their own manifest, it provides the hash of the manifest as well. And it gives you one layer. And then you have, from those, you can then construct the artifact dependency graph. So if you've got a set of a bunch of artifact inputs and their manifests, that you can then sort of recursively gather all those together, and you have this overall graph of the dependencies. And I think first of all, this is sort of framed here in the context of just explaining what OmniBOR is, that you kind of start with the identifiers. It's like, okay, you need a way to name all of your artifacts and your inputs, and so okay, we have identifiers, and then it's once you have identifiers, how do you go about explaining their relationship to each other? It's like, okay, you have the input manifest, and then once you have a bunch of input manifests, what can you do with them? And the answer is you can resolve this dependency graph, and then use the dependency graph to try and do comparisons and assess hey, is this dependency graph equal to this dependency graph? Are these Like if they're not, what exact items are different? And that's sort of the power you get from it. And I will say, not all of this naming was what I initially had. Ed had good comments down below this, which really helped to, even for me to clarify. So I think initially, yeah, I said like OmniBOR identifier, OmniBOR manifest. But I think artifact identifier and artifact input manifest are clearer. And, I think it's sort of provides a nice flow that also that all of these start with the word artifact. So, yeah.
So do other folks have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I really like this framing. It I think encapsulates the sort of the state of the design pretty well. Like I have only one nitpick really, which is I'm wondering, like in artifact input manifest, what is the word artifact actually referring to there? Like, I wonder if there's a, because what it's expressing is the set of inputs to a process that produced this artifact. And I guess, like, obviously we don't want to try and encapsulate that entire phrase in this term.
It's an important distinction, but it's a terrible moniker.
Yeah. So
it could be.
Yes, artifact is fine there. I'm just like
what if we
particularly
imagine something like artifact build input manifest? It makes it a little bit longer, but it makes it clear that the inputs are to the build and not to the artifact.
Action input manifest. I mean, that introduces this idea of actions, which you'd have to explain. So
yeah, I mean, I do want to back up for a second, and I don't want to distract too much, Jeremy, from your focusing on the word artifact in this, but the word input here I like very much, and this was basically your sort of matter-of-fact recognition that what we're really talking about is the inputs to the builds. And then people, for reasons I can't put my finger on, they like manifests. There are a lot of manifests in their life that seem to make their life better. And so I in principle, you could have an artifact input document, but manifest in some ways has a friendlier feeling to it in my mind here. I don't know how other people feel.
I think it's just a bit more specific. I mean, the trouble with the word document is that it's incredibly generic. Like pretty much anything can be a document. Whereas the term manifest has been broadly adopted as a way of, listing items. And so I think it's a good fit here.
I'll also say I added a comment down below just to capture, Jeremy, capture your feedback, just in part because I don't want to sort of mentally lose track of that issue, and hopefully I've characterized it well in the description there.
Yeah.
So they're it strikes me that they're. Yeah, thank you by the way, Jeremy, because sometimes I like a thing, but I can't put my finger on the why, and it being more specific is actually a really good explanation of the why my gut prefers manifest to document, and so that's helpful to me.
Can I?
And
one other.
Please. Oh, sorry. Did we miss a raise hand?
I didn't raise my hand, but I'm just jumping in. The other thing is that as we think about bills of material, manifests and bills of material, at least in law, are nearly synonymous.
Oh, interesting.
So, kind of the whole supply chain thing, what's the manifest of what's on the truck? Yeah. So I think that it feels very good from kind of kinetic world rather than cyber world.
It's a cohesive terminology with everything else.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is basically near unanimous jubilation about input manifest, and then a little bit of question about the word artifact here, in the sense that we really are, when you get down to brass tacks, talking about the inputs to a build process, the output of which is the artifact. And I would sort of, go ahead.
Actually, finish your thought.
Well, the thing that weighs on the opposite side of my mind is that this terminology does make it very clear that we are reasoning about the the artifacts, what goes into them, and the dependency graph of what goes into them all the way down. Does that make sense?
Yes, I really like the separation of each individual step versus the entire graph, which is the assembly of those steps.
Mm-hmm. And it makes it clear that the thing we're talking about at the end of the day, the thing we're mostly reasoning vis-a-vis is artifacts. Because one of the things I see where people sometimes get confused is there's a lot of tendency in the SBOM world to talk about projects. And projects are actually a super useful way to talk about, oh, these group of humans over here have organized a big bucket of code. But they're very fuzzy things to try and get down to brass tacks with, if that makes sense.
Right,
Like
so this feels
projects
more concrete.
So just kind of going back to artifact input manifest, how about artifact collection manifest? Or artifact set manifest?
No, I think input is the important word there.
Okay, I'm also looking at artifact dependency graph and trying to figure out if we use manifest as the description of the collection, then you wind up with an artifact graph manifest and an artifact input manifest. And so, you know, they're different materializations of the manifest, but they're all manifests. They're all kind of the set of things. They just happen to be formatted in a particular way.
So
Go ahead,
that's a really
please.
interesting point. One thing related to that strikes me, we have an inconsistency right now where there's, we have the input manifest, and from that we derive the dependency graph. We could imagine instead having a dependency manifest from which we derive the dependency graph, or having an input manifest from which we derive the input graph. You sort of consider that maybe there's an inconsistency with having, input at one stage and dependency as the term of art at the next stage. And I think of this too in the sense of, I think when people often think about dependencies, they think about that in the sense of third-party dependencies, not necessarily like, all of the files that I have that I've written that, go into the thing that I'm building, but, the third-party stuff, like I import some package from somewhere.
You are, I think, perhaps overly generous. My experience has been over very long terms and a very broad array of folks, that most people, when they think of dependencies, they think of specifically the thing they imported. If I had a nickel for every time I sort of said to someone, you need to go deal with, bar, and they said, no, but I don't use bar. I just import foo. It's like, yes, but foo is down the transitive dependency graph of bar.
Right. People are not considering the transitive nature of all their dependencies.
Well, and that problem actually goes all the way up and down the discussion in supply chain management fractally, because a very large number of folks that I've talked with about supply chain management only think about their immediate process in front of them and the immediate top level inputs to that process. And so when you sort of point out that like some of those inputs come from other places that themselves have processes that have inputs, like that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
I think the input versus dependency came up a couple of weeks ago, and it was to clarify that the inputs are the first order inputs. They don't have that like there's no implication of transitivity for input, I don't think, whereas dependency is a little bit ambiguous as to whether you're talking about the first order or entire transitive dependencies. And so I think dependency graph makes sense. Like dependency graph,
consider that a purposeful inconsistency that's actually drawing a meaningful distinction. That's a good point.
Well, the other thing I want to sort of point out a little bit here, and this is really good that we're having this conversation because it sort of puts a sharp point on it, is that so far in discussing the OmniBOR spec, and I think this is probably the right place to start, we've talked about artifact identifiers, we've talked about artifact input manifests, we've talked about the fact that artifact dependency graphs exist as sort of the collect together of the pieces, the artifact input manifests down the chain. But we don't currently have a spec for a document format where I would hand you the entire artifact dependency graph. And I don't think we have to get there now. I think at some point there will be some movement to standardize some formats for how to put these things together. But I don't think we have to get there now. I mean, and I have personal things that have bumped around in the back of my head. Like, I like a lot the way that YAML allows multiple documents to go into the same file by just putting 3 dashes on a line as a document delimiter. But again, we don't have to go into that discussion now because I don't think that has to be worked out yet. But I think that's sort of my point is I don't think we've quite gotten to the point where we're talking about having any kind of file format for the artifact dependency graph itself. It's sort of go grab all the input manifests and you can construct it.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost self-assembling in that way. Like the key thing that you would want to know is like where your starting point is. Like if you were just given a whole bunch of these manifest objects, you could assemble them together into a graph, but you wouldn't know what it meant.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, yeah. You need the entry point, so to speak. But if you've got an entry point and you've got a store of artifact input manifests of any kind, then you can basically take the entry point and traverse down the graph. And the file format stuff that we've got for build tools, because many of them, and I understand, Jeremy, not all of them, many of them are writing out to file systems, is essentially just a way of producing a really, really simple artifact input manifest store. So that people can actually just drop it somewhere and go. But part of the reason I like the fact that we haven't specified an artifact dependency graph document format yet is it leaves some space for people to innovate around how they do these artifact input manifest stores. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like I don't think there is a natural boundary necessarily to this graph because it does arbitrarily compose.
Right.
But there's one other point I just wanted to get back to about the artifact input manifest. Like a couple of weeks ago, we were discussing what would happen if you didn't embed the manifest IDs into the output artifacts. And the effect of that is that if you're not doing the embedding, then you have to basically refer to every output artifact as a tuple of its manifest ID, of its input manifest and the artifact itself, to give you an unambiguous graph.
True.
I don't really know if that's, I mean, I think it's important, but I don't quite know how it fits in with this.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I suspect I have this experience all the time where it's like, this has the feeling of importantness, but I don't know what to do with it yet.
Oh, by the way, thank you for setting up the discussions. I guess I triggered that when I mentioned it, but
you absolutely did.
So a thing that I have been meaning to write up, and now I have a venue to write it up, is also introducing the idea of input kinds. So extending the input manifest with an extra field per input that says what this input is for, like how it's being used. And I see it as a potential way to like reconcile the like what tools are, but also give more meaning to these manifests without overly specifying, like overly embellishing them.
You might, for that, just in terms of like taxonomic prior art, there's the like relationship field, I forget the exact name of it, in SPDX that has just a ton of different relationship types for at least at the package level, how things can relate to each other. Obviously, we're looking at a slightly different level of abstraction, but the listing there might be a useful sort of reference point for this.
What I had in mind was just using Git OIDs to refer to documents that are sort of like well known Like, so we might have a document that just sort of says, this is an input source file. And it might literally be that string, and then use the get ID of that as the, how to identify input source files. And then if you have a build step, you could say, oh, this was a GCC, or this was a C compiler, or this was Clang with this specific set of arguments. And, you could have a Gitto ID for any of those things. And so you get to choose how much resolution you want versus how much breaking of the, like how much perturbation of the hashes you want to introduce.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting idea. I would be very interested to see that explored. The one thing, and I suspect this is bouncing around in your head as you're thinking about the idea because of your comment about perturbations of the tree, is you'd like to try and get as close to deterministic as you can. In terms of you would prefer that two independent entities that are doing effectively the same thing differ, either don't differ or only differ in ways that have to do with actual differences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so I think, I mean, also this discussion from a couple of weeks ago, I think, or maybe it was last week, about like different use cases care about different differences. And so we need to, I think, just have the flexibility of being able to accommodate those different use cases. It does, I think, mean that we don't necessarily have a single OmniBOR graph for all possible use cases. It's still going to be the case that people are going to be computing different document ID, like different manifest IDs and things like that, that contain the information that's necessary for their use case.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a really important point. Just as an example of something I've been thinking about for that is if you're trying to identify the difference between the contents of a package that you would get from, let's say, NPM versus the contents of the package that's like at that same tagged version in a repo. I know some package managers allow you to say to do things like, hey, exclude these files from, inclusion in the actual package for whatever reason, like they're not necessary to ship. And so you could have a situation where you had a manifest produced for the thing that sits in the source repo that differs from what ships in the package repo, but in ways that aren't necessarily meaningful to you as user of the software, and having a sense of like what resolution those are done at, and I think would be important and relevant. Otherwise, you'd sort of say like, oh, these are different, even though it's not like a meaningful difference.
So in the interest of time right now, I'm going to vigorously encourage you, Jeremy, to start that discussion here and suggest that we may want to move on to other items in the agenda. What I'm hearing is that structurally, we have pretty unanimous agreement that structurally we like this. We have a little bit of niggling about the word artifact here at the beginning of input manifests. Am I missing anything about niggles other than that? Because I don't want to misrepresent, I don't want to manufacture consensus. I'd like to record consensus. Go ahead, Dave.
So I think, and this goes to Andrew's point about, kind of the difference between graphs. So in other words, everything's a Merkle tree. So if there's even the smallest change, we're going to have a different root node. I actually see that as okay, as long as we can do graph diffs. In other words, find commonalities in graphs. So in other words, if you have a few things that are changed, the commonalities in the graph are actually going to point you to the things that are uncommon across the two graphs. And those things might be the interesting things. So, to your point, Andrew, yeah, you're exactly right that we may have little niggly things that cause the graph to change or cause the root node to change. But the more data that we have, and I think this goes to Jeremy's point, the more we can say, okay, here's the reason for the differences. And that leads to an analysis of, and do they matter for our use case, for our security use case or something else?
And one of the things I want to be a little bit careful about is one of the things that has been, I think, helpful to OmniBOR is that we're working on a very specific problem and we're trying not to poach from neighboring problem spaces, if that makes sense. Like, we don't have any opinion about how you sign any of this stuff. Why? Because there are lots of people doing signing and they're doing a good job of it, and we don't have a lot to offer there. When you look at sort of capturing the full space of metadata around build steps, there are existing projects like in Toto that are literally in the business of capturing, this is exactly what happened at this step. And so if we're going to expand into some of that, I want to make sure that we're doing things that couldn't just be done by having in toto reference artifact identifiers or the identifiers for artifact input manifests, that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, the other one that I tend to think in terms of is I have this notion of spurious differences. And the one I always use as an example is -I for GCC is almost always a spurious difference, right? Because if I put stuff in my home directory and you put it in yours, who the hell cares, right? The difference in the build process is largely irrelevant. And so I don't think we want to capture spurious differences in the process.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, my point really is that what one person might consider spurious, another person considers to be essential. Like if you're trying to do a reproducible build and you've already gone through the effort of normalizing all your path names, then exactly what you put behind your -I is important, potentially. Like if you want to be able to actually reproduce that output artifact. But if you don't care about if you don't care about reproducibility, then the input ID of that header file will already capture, like is path independent. So it doesn't really matter like what path you found the header file at, so long as you found a header file with the right content.
well, I mean, so say a little bit more about that, because you've got a very broad experience in all of these things. Because in my mind, if I'm trying to do reproducible builds, as long as I have some way to go and resolve an input an include statement where I can go find the correct input artifact, the correct file to be included, where it happens to be is kind of immaterial to the reproducibility of the build in my mind. Does that make sense?
So what I'm thinking about is like if you had a source tree that's got like a dozen foo.h's, they're all different for whatever reason, and the input artifact will capture the hash of the specific foo.h that you got. But if you're trying to reproduce the build, if you don't know what the -I option is, you have to guess at which foo.h it actually ended up resolving to. Or you have to like search them all and find the one that matches the hash or something like that.
No, I mean,
So,
I see your point entirely, because I've thought some of these things on the reproducible build front. Like if I've got this artifact dependency graph and I've got a pile of stuff, how would I go roughly reproduce this? And obviously, you're absolutely right. I want to make sure that however I'm resolving the include, that I'm getting the actual same input at that include step. So I think the only point that you and I differ is you were thinking about it in terms of capturing the -I, and I have been thinking about it slightly differently. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Anyway, apologies. We should go back to, we've gotten well down this whole rabbit hole. So on the general observations and questions on the spec, a whole bunch of these got merged last time. There was some ongoing discussion on the intro section that I think where we're sort of sorting some of this out in our discussion that we're having here on discussion 41. So my suggestion would be, rather than having that discussion live here, would you be willing, Andrew, to sort of link in the add intro section to connect it to the discussion so we can sort of hash out some of that there?
It's still muted. Yeah, okay, so do you want the link to that to go into the discussion page? Do you want the link to the discussion to go into the intro thing?
Yes.
All right, I will do that.
Yeah. Because I think they're highly related. And I think how do we introduce this to people is highly, highly related to getting a good intro section. You were saying, Jeremy?
Oh, I put up issue 36, which is another bunch, I think, of spec comments. Though at least some of it has been addressed by Andrew's sort of nomenclature. Like the first part is a big discussion about definitions and terminology. But I think there's a bunch of other stuff in there that is worth discussing at some point, either live or.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I actually have still captured that here. And I apologize I haven't gotten more in-depth response to it, but I will sort of claim credit for good fortune by pointing out that particularly in the terminology front, you've gotten a better outcome by virtue of Andrew wandering in than you would have if I just tried to respond to your comments on that.
Yeah.
So, which is to say, no, your comments have absolutely not been forgotten. But I do appreciate you making sure that they haven't fallen off, because they tend to be very helpful.
Well, I think, I mean, it's just that there's a general conversation, I think, about these sort of details, and so we could just fold them all together rather than having to consider them all independently.
No, I think that's probably true, and I think next time I take a pass at the agenda, I'll try and roll the pieces together, because I think there's a lot less going on than it looks like looking at the agenda. We do still have the proposal to only generate OmniBOR when the OmniBOR is specified. But sadly, we don't have Ava today. And this is, if I recall correctly, Ava is the person who has strong feelings in the opposite direction. And I am relatively disinclined to make calls about things in the absence of passionate partisans, if that makes sense to folks. Yeah. It feels vaguely underhanded to go and decide something when someone who cares a lot about it is not in the room. And I think the location to restore OmniBOR docs is probably directly related to that. So here, I think, Brathy, you've captured a lot more detailed information around PR35. Let's see. Is there something you would like to highlight here, Brathy?
I think this can be discussed when we, along with the previous issue, right? I was asked to just capture everything else, so I created in a separate issue instead of just appending to the earlier one, because one is deciding whether you need to create OmniBOR documents with and without the option, and the other one is what should be the nature of the location itself where you.
Well, and we got into some of the questions about being right only, about what happens in the case of a collision.
Yes.
This sort of reminds me a lot of you've probably been around long enough, Jeremy, that you'll appreciate this. Talking to someone at one point who was discouraging the use of FLOC because at the time it didn't work reliably over NFS, and instead encouraging the use of the fact that link and unlink are guaranteed to be atomic, even across NFS. So, which leads to lots of fun games.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Oh, you know of examples where link and unlink are not atomic?
I know there's a lot of shitty NFS implementations.
Oh no, and quite honestly, the number of shitty NFS implementations has grown extensively since the old graybeard who made that point to me made his point. So you're absolutely entirely possibly correct. But I'm not sure how a link or an unlink could be half done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you might be right, but I'm sure there's a way. There's a lot of creativity around that.
There is indeed a huge amount of creativity in the concurrency space. A huge amount. All right, we've got